Hello. And oh, fan off here. Okay. Hello. Thank you for choosing Tower System Services. How is everyone doing today? You missed me? Oh, that's good. I missed you too. In fact, I missed you so much that I didn't really have anything particular to talk about today. There's a reason the stream is titled the way it is. Um, I just wanted to hang out and stream. There was nothing like particular to like really discuss today. It's been kind of a slow news day really. For like the past few days, I guess, or for the last couple of weeks after Metaphor dropped. Nothing really big happening with gaming like at the moment, but we're also headed into um we're headed deeper into the fall season and deeper into the fourth quarter. November and December, I imagine there's going to be quite a bit going on. Eventually we're going to get that Switch 2 announcement. Maybe this year. I don't know. I don't know if they've said that. Other than that, I've just been really enjoying Metaphor. I have no idea how some of you have like already like beaten the 100-hour game when it just came out 10 days ago. You guys are crazy. Uh like I'm like, damn, man. I do not have that kind of time, like Jesus. Um, I wish I did though. I'm quite envious, but yeah, that's not going to be the thing for me for the foreseeable future where I can realistically do that. Yo, Ryan, talk about Tim Rogers pixel art Sakaguchi Sonic Mania style Final Fantasy 17 idea. That's like really interesting. It's a very fascinating topic. But sure. So a few years back, we had actually take this thing off. So a few years back, actually, we had Tim Rogers come on to our podcast on here. And on it, Tim Rogers said, wouldn't it be awesome if Hironobu Sakaguchi came back for one last Final Fantasy game? Now, of course, we all want Hironobu Sakaguchi to come back for one last FF game. Like, I don't think that there's a single person in this chat or in existence that's going to be like, no, don't let Sakaguchi work on a new Final Fantasy game. I don't think anyone's like really pushing that. No one's sane. I assume most of you are based individuals that would very much love Sakaguchi's return. That being said, Sakaguchi is in his 60s now, I want to say. And I don't think it's really in him to actually let me fact check that real quick. Yeah. Hironobu Sakaguchi is 61 and developing AAA games takes 7 to 8 years. And it is a very stressful 7 to 8 years. And I don't think Sakaguchi would realistically want to work on a mainline title that takes that long at that age. I mean, I personally wouldn't. Sakaguchi does want to keep working on games. However, most of the games that he's going to be working on are going to be more in the A or AA range, something like Fantasian. However, Tim Rogers was proposing that maybe you get Sakaguchi to come back and make Final Fantasy 17 a pixel art game. And I think that Tim was actually still right about this. I think he was actually kind of cooking. And part of the reason that I think that he cooked there is because there is still a strong desire for Sakaguchi to come back. But it's not just that. I think that Final Fantasy 17 is going to be a long time. Like, it's not going to be coming anytime soon, especially coming off of, the sales expectations not being met for 16 and Rebirth. I think that Square Enix probably wants a little bit of time to reevaluate where they're going with Final Fantasy next in terms of the next big thing. Squall UA, thank you for the tier 1. Thank you for joining us. So I think they are going to take some time and kind of cook up the next big mainline Final Fantasy. I think it's going to be a lot further out than we're thinking, because I think Final Fantasy 17 needs to be a really good game, like an exceptionally good game. It's tough because every Final Fantasy nowadays has the burden of being the game that brings Final Fantasy back, quote unquote. Like that's the kind of headline that gets placed on every single FF game, is that this is the game that's going to bring it back to the 90s. And whether that's happened yet is debatable. However, whether that expectation gets placed on every game, you know, whether it's 13, it was placed on 15, it was placed on 16, it was placed on Retrilogy, and I assure you it'll also be placed on 17. Again, regardless of whether you agree with that statement or not, the expectation is still there. So, would it be a bad idea, since Sakaguchi is working with Yoshi P again, or not again, but they're working together? Since Sakaguchi and Yoshi P are working together, why not have Final Fantasy 17 by Hironobu Sakaguchi? And it is a pixel game. And that pixel game is the game that fills in the space between Final Fantasy 16 and whatever the next mainline numbered title is, right? I think it could serve a lot of, or I think it could do a lot of good, right? You know, for people who are really wanting that return to traditional FF, ATB, the world map, it can be a massive celebration of that. And I think people would respond to it really well. I think that people would absolutely love it. You know, there is also another option too, I think. And that's not just the pixel art style. You could also do the PS1 Fantasian style, right? Like the sort of pre-render background. Maybe not like an actual diorama like in the way that Fantasian has, but something that is kind of like reminiscent of the PS1 style. But I think if they were going to do anything and Sakaguchi was the one choosing it, I think you would do a pixel game, because I think that would be like the most full circle thing that they could do, is to kind of bring Final Fantasy back to being a pixel game. And they could have that pixel game, again, serve as this filler between the next two mainline Final Fantasy titles. And I think a lot of the purists would love it. It would also introduce traditional Final Fantasy to new fans. So to newer people who've gotten into the series through Retrilogy or 16, it would allow them to kind of have a pixel Final Fantasy game for them. And yeah, it's not out of nowhere that, or I should say, that Tim Rogers kind of cooked with that. And part of the reason I think he cooked is because here is what Yoshi P said on that exact manner. Yoshi P. Hold on, let me bring it up. This statement also pissed off a ton of people too. Who the hell is beating on my door and ringing my doorbell like that? Sorry. I'll let my girlfriend take care of that. We'll take a look at this. Actually, wait, they say this was the first time he brought it up? Final Fantasy 17 will have a different, fresh battle system? Oh, God. He said, I fully understand the appeal and potential there is for turn-based or command games. I still think Square Enix will have the opportunity to create something like that, I'd personally say that if you're going to create something like that, maybe have graphics to fit the system better by going towards a more pixel graphic type direction. But does that mean, okay, Final Fantasy 17 pixel graphics confirmed? I don't know about that, laughter, because once you've taken the graphics this far with FF16 and you decide to go back to pixel graphics with it, then people are going to be like, hey, what are you doing? Why are you going back to pixel graphics? So, and then, oops, that's my brainstorm video. My brainstorm list for video. um, so yeah, it's out there. He's thought about it. He's thought about uh making a pixel game for Final Fantasy and going back to turn-based to do it. 1 second. Okay, what was the article that was on screen? Did I already click off of it? I can put it in the chat for you. Sorry, I was preoccupied with something. This was the article. Anyway, going back to it, this article, this interview rather, pissed a ton of people off because he was basically saying, wait, why do you have to go back to pixel graphics in order for a game to be turn-based? And I think the thing that like a lot of people are missing here is that it's not necessarily that you have to go back to pixel graphics, but what he's really saying here, if you read between the lines, is that he's really saying that you're not going to get investors to invest in a big AAA game and have it be essentially turn-based, right? They're not going to spend $200 million on what they essentially feel is a risk. And the graphical standard of Final Fantasy is something they feel they can't back down from, right? Pan back to the brainstorm list. We're intrigued. The brainstorm list. Oh my god. It's like it's very just uninspired video ideas that I'm just like I was like top 10 RPGs of all time, something metaphor. Final Fantasy 7 OG has the best ending. Could Final Fantasy 10 3 be good? Definitely not gonna do the Final Fantasy sales one because I think I talked about that one enough. I feel like I've already talked about this to death, and I've already put out enough one. So we can go ahead and like literally scratch that one out. The obsession with remakes is something that I still might do. Death in Persona 3, like, God, I've already wrote like a page on this one. I don't have like a specific title yet. I don't want it to just be like a normal Persona 3 essay about death, but like, I'm like trying to figure. I want it to be like the Final Fantasy X video, but about like Persona 3. I'm working on it. This one will definitely happen. This one happens like every year. Is the remakes one because of Susie? It's not because of Susie. Although Susie did add some interesting um juice to the mix. Let's just say. Um it was actually because of Horizon Zero Dawn remaster more than anything though. I'll actually talk about remakes more in a second here. But to round out the Final Fantasy 17 pixel art discussion, essentially, you know, they don't want to spend that much money on something that they view as high risk when doing something aggressively AAA with the visuals of Final Fantasy 16 is seen as risky to do something turn-based like that. Most turn-based games are technically AA and not AAA, hence why they don't feature the aggressively realistic graphics that we associate with AAA. Even something like Expedition 33, which a lot of people think is AAA from looking at it. Expedition 33 is actually a AA game. There's only like 30 people working on it or something like that. I'm sure they have like, some outsourcing and stuff like that. However, Expedition 33's team is like small. Remember that like, with AAA games, hundreds, if not thousands of hands are touching a project. And then you have something like this where it's like a very, very, very small team that's working on it. And it's incredible. Like Unreal Engine has streamlined development to that point where these smaller teams are able to make something that looks like it's AAA, but in fact, it's actually still AA. And the developers recently confirmed this, that they're not even going to charge full price for it. The game is going to be 30 hours long, and it's only going to be $50. This is something that Sandfall Interactive has confirmed for Expedition 33. So, one thing about turn-based games compared to action games is that action games require a lot more people. They require a lot more work, a lot more animations, a lot more scripting, because enemy behavior in an action game is like insane, and you have to do a lot of work in order to make enemy behavior look and feel cool in an action game. And so with turn-based games, you are able to do a lot faster stuff, a lot easier, a lot cheaper. And so I don't think you could make a game like Expedition 33 with like the scope that they're doing it, probably being action. So I do think that, the first thing I thought of when I had saw the pixel thing that we were talking about just a second ago was what Tim had said. And I do think, yeah, that's like the perfect filler game. But also too, I think that an option for Square is to just put out a turn-based spin-off Final Fantasy game, right? Put out a lower budget, or let's just say it like this. They should have a AA spin-off of Final Fantasy that's not like the main numbered series. And that can be a game that's more purist. It can have like fixed camera angles like a PS1 game. It can look like Fantasian. It can have a world map and ATB and all this other stuff that Final Fantasy fans are desperate to have. And they can sort of please their veteran audience with that. It's kind of what Nintendo's actually been doing with Zelda, right? Like we have the 2D Zelda games that are like specifically for the old school Zelda audience. They also do it with Mario. They do it with Mario, guys. They have the 2D Marios. 2D Mario is not dead. If you grew up loving 2D Mario, you're still getting 2D Marios, and you're getting 3D Marios. So again, like one thing that Nintendo's done like really well is that as they evolve their style, they also put out these spin-off titles, these smaller titles that are able to kind of satisfy their veterans. It's called Octopath Traveler. See, this is where I disagree. Is that Octopath or Bravely Default are just like sub-ins for Final Fantasy. And I understand that they're very similar to Final Fantasy, but if they were just, how should I say this? If there is nothing special about Final Fantasy and any game can just be Final Fantasy, even if it's not called that, then why are we even doing or caring about Final Fantasy, right? Like, there has to be something about the brand and why it is labeled Final Fantasy that makes it special, that makes it so that like, an Octopath can't come in and just be Final Fantasy, right? Like, if Final Fantasy is something special, and not just another JRPG, then I think we're not able to just say that, like, oh, if you want turn-based Final Fantasy, just play insert other game. Or if you want Final Fantasy like this, to just play an entirely different thing. So basically, what you're saying when you say that is that the things that you want from Final Fantasy, you should not get from Final Fantasy. Well, then what is the point of the brand? Like, what is the brand even doing at that point? So I don't think we can just say that, like, you know, all these games that are not labeled Final Fantasy are Final Fantasy. Just go play them instead. Because at that point, what even is Final Fantasy and why do we care? If everything else can meet the needs of Final Fantasy, right? So I do think that there is a need for Final Fantasy to be something. It can't just be anything. And again, I want to stress that it's not to say that like those games can't be Final Fantasies, but it's also to say that um why do we need spin-offs with the FF label then? Yeah, that's also kind of the thing too. Is that people want it to be Final Fantasy, but I also think that there is a special quality about Final Fantasies, right? That like if anything can just be a Final Fantasy and it's not like doesn't need to even be labeled Final Fantasy. It could just be like, oh, that's Final Fantasy. Then the brand kind of becomes a like, then what is the brand? Like, what is Final Fantasy then? Um, so I do think it has to be a specific thing. So I guess simply put, if I was Square, I would continue to make action games. I continue to make action mainline titles that do have hybrid elements into them. So they do have strategic elements. They're not purely action games. I don't think they should go with the pure action style, but I think they should have some type of command element. Rebirth, again, Final Fantasy VII Re-Trilogy. Not to say that, the next game needs to be exactly like Re-Trilogy, but it is to say that the controlling other party members and having some type of, command style targeting enemy weaknesses, that should definitely be there. Whatever they want to evolve that into next, that's fine. However, I think it would be a really great idea if they did do some type of spin-off that was really focused on kind of pleasing their veteran fan base too, and then that way everyone wins because everyone gets more FF, and it also allows the mainline series to kind of breathe because then you can say there is literally a Final Fantasy game that you can play right now, you know, that has all of these things that you want. And since they are working with Sakaguchi again, bring Sakaguchi in and have him do it. That's what I would do. Also, technically, Bravely is FF in the same way Mana is. They are under the umbrella spin-offs and they're kind of their own thing at the same time because BD was made as the successor to Four Heroes of Light. That's fair. Um, but I think at the same time too, it's like if people want like a new mainline SMT game, saying like, well, there is Persona, but it's not. Persona's not. I mean, it is SMT, but it's also not literally SMT in the same way anymore. So, if that comparison works for you. Also, Claire I, hello. Metaphor being praised for doing the bare minimum. What are you talking about? This is why you like 13. Um, Persona is mainline SMT. You're really dishing out the hot takes. Um, it's funny we all always get together and discuss Final Fantasy, and one question always makes us mad: what is your favorite FF? It changes every day, but I think that like the past few months, it's been 10. Um, someone had asked earlier about the remakes thing. Um, so we can talk about that actually, because that's actually pretty funny. I think remakes are really good. I don't think that remakes are the devil, that remakes are necessarily bad. I think a lot of the games that I played over the past few years, in particular, a lot of the best games have been remakes. I don't think that remakes are, necessarily a thing that shouldn't exist. We've been toying around with remakes since, like, I mean, the Super Nintendo era, right? Where you could get like Mario like 1 through 3 on like a Super Nintendo cartridge, and it had like better graphics and stuff for the game. Was it called like Mario All Stars, right? And those were essentially remakes or remasters of a sort. So we've had remakes in some shape or form for a really long time. They're nothing new. I do think that we kind of toe a line though sometimes, or we have to toe a line. It is easy for people to get so caught up in remakes and so caught up in having that 90s nostalgia again, trying to essentially relive their childhood, that we can lose sight of new games. And I don't just mean fans when I say that, I actually mean companies, perhaps even more so. The reason that companies really love remakes and remasters is because they're a lot faster to get out in a number of ways. They are also they have a guaranteed ROI to them, because you know that this many people bought the original, and so there's a ton of people that are also going to be interested in getting a remake of that game. Because of that, remakes are a very reliable source of income most of the times. You can pump those things out, and you know that it's a proven product that is going to sell well. And this is why everything is getting a remake now. Because, if you want to turn your money into more money, fulfill your fiduciary duty as a company, are you going to take a risk on some brand new IP that you don't know what people are going to like? Or are you going to take a risk doing something that you know everybody already loves? It's easier to just do the thing that you know is proven to have a great response, that is proven to have millions of people interested in it. And so, as a result, companies will always love to do remakes. And I don't think remakes are bad. Some remakes are quite necessary. For me, one of those remakes I think that was really necessary was Persona 3 Reload, right? Like, the only version of Persona 3 that you could buy, which for a long time you couldn't buy any version of it unless you had like a PS3, and then you like went on the PlayStation shop for PS3 and bought it. They only made Persona 3 portable playable. And a lot of people still wanted the 3D maps, and how could you blame them? So Persona 3 Reload serves a very valuable function by having a playable version of Persona 3 that we just did not have before. I think remakes and remasters also preserve titles, right? Like, a lot of people are playing games for the first time, experiencing all of these wonderful things that we grew up with, and they got introduced to it through a remake, through a remaster, and that's awesome. So I also think that there is sort of like an obligation to remake and remaster certain things to make sure that they are up to current standards so that they can continue to be enjoyed by future generations. But I also think that there is an opportunity cost here too as well, where every time we do a remake, that's a studio that is locked into place with creating something, for the next, on the short end of the spectrum, maybe 4 years, on the long end of the spectrum, maybe 8 years. Typically, remakes, you're probably looking at 4 to 5 years. But it's a very long time. It's a very long time, and um, as a result, there is a huge opportunity cost, right? Because we're working on that remakes, because we're making remakes of games, we're not creating new games. And so that means that that team that could have been working on the next big hit will not be working on that next big hit. They'll be working on recreating a hit from the past, right? And I don't know if it is a hot take, but there really haven't been like a terrible number of remakes, I feel like, that have been hugely influential or necessarily. Now that I think about it, I don't think a single remake has ever won Game of the Year, has it? Yeah, I think Resident Evil 4 remake and Final Fantasy 7 remake are probably the closest that we've ever had to remakes winning Game of the Year. And of course, Final Fantasy 7 Rebirth may win Game of the Year as well. However, Game of the Year doesn't tend to go to remakes, like when you really think about it. They may at best get nominated, but they don't tend to actually win. And the reason I bring this up in particular is because I think that, again, remakes, while good, don't tend to be able to generally push the bar as much for like what a video game can do and be, because it's built around the design restrictions of what the original game was. This is less so the case with the Resident Evil remakes, and even less so the case with the 7R trilogy, because they absolutely will change things up to make it match a modern game. Um, and so, yeah. Um, Rebirth doesn't even feel like a remake at this point. In terms of gameplay, it's not. It's a brand new game. In terms of gameplay, Rebirth is Final Fantasy 17, right? Um, that's what it is. Remakes can be used to teach newer teams the ropes. The recent Zelda game developed by Grizzo, they cut their teeth on the Zelda series by doing Ocarina of Time, Majora's Mask 3D remakes, and the Link's Awakening remake, while Nintendo themselves reworked Skyward Sword, Breath of the Wild, and Tears of the Kingdom. That's no good. That's a good use of remakes, IMO. Satisfies fans and builds up a new team eventually to be able to hand the reins. Yeah, I think that's like the best use of remakes, is that when remakes are kind of used to introduce a new team to a game so that they can help build on the IP in terms of brand new games for that series, right? So I do think remakes are good, and I do think that remakes serve an important function. But I also think that, you know, eventually too, we do have to make new games. And I also think that remakes have a sort of ceiling to them in terms of the level of influence, in terms of how typically good they can be, unless they're doing something insane, like a Final Fantasy VII re-trilogy style. We are reworking the whole thing. We're essentially rebuilding the game such that it's a brand new game, right? That's when you can kind of reach beyond. But even then, Final Fantasy VII re-trilogy is still beholden to the original game story in a way that I didn't think it was actually going to be whenever we first got introduced to FF7 re-trilogy, because Final Fantasy VII Remake's ending, is kind of like, oh, we're defying destiny and the unknown journey is ahead of us. And whenever you beat Final Fantasy VII Remake Part 1, you feel like the door is open for anything to happen. And then you play Rebirth, and then most of Rebirth is fairly faithful to Final Fantasy VII. Not in like a huge way, where it's like this directly contradicts Final Fantasy VII for most of it. You have the Zack threads that are being weaved in the background, but it never like stands out as like, oh, this is completely counterintuitive to, what the story is so far. Until the ending, where I think you can absolutely make that argument outright. The ending is where things yeah. But prior to the ending, most of it is pretty faithful and weaves some stuff in, and then the ending ends up kind of pushing things pretty crazy, right? But then I guess the big question there is that does part 3 go differently, or does part 3 stay the same? But then you would expect part 3 to mostly stay faithful too, right? But the end of Rebirth has so much new stuff in it. Like Cloud is seeing Aerith, and then he has that empty materia, and then there's the rip in the sky, and there's all this crazy stuff happening. And so what the fuck, right? It's like, is it going to be different? Is it not going to be different? I don't know. What do you think will win best narrative? Metaphor maybe has a shot. I haven't finished it yet, so I can't say. But it has a shot. Um, it's a really good story so far. One thing I'll never understand about FF9 Remake is why they're giving it the remake to a game that needs it the least. Remake 6, 8, or 5 first. My boy, remakes are not about the game that needs it the most. Remakes are about the game that sold the most. And thus its remake will sell a lot as well. That's what remakes are about. I mean, you could have I mean, well, I forgot what I was gonna say actually. But yeah, remakes are about like what they think is gonna sell. Less about like um how much a title needs it. Because if we were starting with titles that needed it, the first Final Fantasy remake would have been 2, and then they would have remade maybe 8, and then they would have remade like 13. I don't mean to group 8 with like 2 and 13. I think 8's a lot better than those games. I just think 8 would benefit a lot better from a remake than say even like 7 or 9, honestly. Because there is a lot more to improve with 8. But you guys get what I'm saying, right? First RE remake would have been Code Veronica. Yeah, exactly, right. Yeah, you would start with the one that's kind of fucked up, but it's got like a lot of potential, so we do that. In an ideal world, to me, that's what remakes would be. It would be the game that's like scuffed up, but it's like it's got some sauce in there somewhere. And so we're gonna redo it and get it right this time. That's what I wish Remake Mania was about. Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, it's easy to just think about games like in terms of artistic wants and desires and needs, but like most of the time when you get into it and you look at like what's being made and why, it's about capitalism, fiduciary duties, what's going to make the most amount of money. Sometimes that aligns with art. You can make it align with like what good art is. And then oftentimes it does not align with what good art is and it's just trash. Very unfortunate. So sometimes you have it work out and then sometimes you don't have it work out and then um yeah. I realize my mic has been facing this. Should I have my mic facing this way? Does it matter? Does it sound different? I think it's the same shit either way. I don't know. I'll know when I listen back to the VOD and then the audio sounds like crap and you guys didn't tell me like the whole time. Chat a little Dragon Quest to us. I that would be a Crossy stream. That would be a Crossy stream. New mic? Yeah, I got the Shure mic. It's so nice. It's very crisp. And I got a new mic arm too. One thing that happens when you listen to your own audio a lot of the time is that you become hyper aware of all the flaws in your audio setup. And I have been listening to my Blue Yeti for a couple of years, few years really. And I became aware of all the audio flaws that I had that maybe even people who listen to me regularly wouldn't be aware of. And it drove me insane. And I just was like, I have to, my audio needs to be perfect. It's like a weird obsession. Everyone kind of pursues the perfect audio setup when you're a content creator because you just listen to so much of your own audio. And even normal people will listen to your audio and they'll be like, there's nothing wrong with it that I can hear. But it's like, I can hear it. I can hear the slight background hum. I could hear this, and and so you just become so obsessed with it that you spend money and you try to do everything you can to make it eventually sound perfect. Going back to remakes, I think the Game Awards needs a best remake category. That's actually a fantastic point. Like, God, uh, give me a second to think on this to not make this sound like as much of a hot take as it is. Okay, I think I got it. Um, I think that the two games that are going to like be added for game of the year, I don't think it's going to be Astrobot. I do think it's going to be between Metaphor and Rebirth. I do. I know Astrobot is rated higher, but you guys need to understand that the highest rated game does not necessarily win every single time. I don't even know where that's come from. People act like the number of points equals the game that wins. That's not how it works. Anyway, I'll say it again. I'd rather have more remakes than 100 more Souls-like. ORAM, that's no. I'd rather have 100 more Souls-likes. Anyway, no, I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. I do think that it will be between Rebirth and Metaphor. Rebirth or Astrobot, Metaphor shouldn't be nominated. Hold the fuck up. Why shouldn't Metaphor be nominated? Why not? Anyways, um, I guess my point was, or that I was going to make, was that the reason that I would even consider Rebirth as my game of the year and why it has been thus far is mostly the parts of it that are new game and not the parts of it that are Final Fantasy VII. Because I think that if it was like Final Fantasy VII literally again updated, then I would probably say I don't think it should be nominated. Because if I'm honest, I do kind of feel that it's probably not great for a remake to win Game of the Year. It is a testament to Rebirth, however, for me to say that it does deserve to win or at the very least be nominated because it does enough profoundly different to be its own game. But generally speaking, I would not nominate or ever vote for a remake to be Game of the Year. And I think Rebirth does enough different to be its own game that is not Final Fantasy VII, if that makes sense. Not to say it's not Final Fantasy VII, but to say that it's like its own Final Fantasy VII game. But yeah, I like straight up just don't think that like nominating remakes is like particularly like great for the most part. I know that's an insanely hot take, but title of the stream, right? Um no, I do think that if a remake's going to be nominated, it needs to do something that's like extraordinarily and profoundly like different as its own game rather than just being a remake of the game. I say this in part because I think it's unfair to like new games. Like I don't think that new games I don't think that new games should be going up against remakes of timeless classics, right? Like I don't know, I feel like it's the same thing winning again, right? Like or like just I don't know. That being said, Rebirth is different because I feel like Rebirth does enough, more than enough, really. You know, Queen's Blood, the way the world map works. It's fundamentally a new game that tells Final Fantasy VII's story. Rebirth is nowhere near OGFF7 except for the characters, the combat, the world, etc. is way different, right? Yeah, it's a new game that retells Final Fantasy VII, but it's not like it's really hard to just say, oh, that's just a remake of Final Fantasy VII, and so that's why I would make that kind of exception for Rebirth and say, okay, I think Rebirth is deserving to be nominated and win Game of the Year. But for general remakes, it's not something I would typically want. Remake/remaster should be its own category at the Game Awards. 100%. I think that they should have their own category and not be competing against new ideas. I feel like having a remake compete against new ideas kind of sucks. To me, at least. Like, I don't want remakes to compete with new ideas. And maybe that's the exception with 7 Re-Trilogy, is that the idea of Seven's idea of a remake is a new idea, right? Like, that's why it is elevated to that point where I can accept it as a nominee versus like, or maybe not as a nominee, because I wouldn't say that like RE4 remake doesn't deserve to be nominated, right? But I wouldn't want it to win. Like, I think I'd be more okay with RE2 remake winning the year it came out than like, because again, that kind of RE2 remake is a lot closer to, again, just like a brand new ass game than RE4 remake was. And so RE2 remake would probably be like another exception where I'd be like, oh, okay. That's a whole ass new game that retells RE2, but it's not just RE2 again, but better. And so I don't know. Like, again, I know that's probably a hot take, but I think that if you're just doing like a normal remake, I wouldn't like I wouldn't normally nominate most remakes for Game of the Year. And that's not to say that remakes aren't great and that there's not like a lot of value offered by remakes. I just feel like that if you're going to do a remake and you want it to be nominated for the game that defined the year, right? And it's the same thing again, then it needs to not be like the same exact thing. But again, it needs to be something that's doing something profoundly different, right? Like, in order for it to like really, in order for me to like really agree with that. I mean, yeah, like the Ava rebuilds, for example, right? The Ava rebuilds are more than just remakes for sure. The RPD section of RE2 Remake is still some of the best atmosphere and gameplay in recent years. That first playthrough in the dark, brilliant, before everyone knew how to fuck with Mr. X. His footsteps were scary as hell, yeah. What do you think of Shadow of the Erdtree getting nominated? I think I would have a lot of problems with Shadow of the Erdtree getting nominated too. Like, that would be kind of an issue for me. I do not think that DLC should win Game of the Year. Straight up, I do not believe DLC is qualified for Game of the Year. I think that Game of the Year should be defined as a game that has released in that year that people can pick up and play right away and not have like you need to play another thing in order to even get into the thing. So I don't believe that like DLC or any type of expanded content should ever qualify as a Game of the Year. Game of the Year should only strictly be defined by games that have released that year. That is the only thing that should ever be nominated for Game of the Year. A full game, a released product that is not a content expansion for another game. Even if that content expansion is the size of a full game, if it is not a full game, it does not deserve to be. Did any other 14 expansions get nominated? No. And I don't think they should be. Service games, I think, should. I mean, I guess it is kind of weird with service games, right? Because they do have expansions. But I think that best ongoing game is best service game of the year. So I think they already have their own category, right? Service games should be able to be nominated when they come out, right? So if you launch an Overwatch or like I guess Overwatch definitely now is considered a service game. With Overwatch 2, I didn't play Overwatch, so actually I don't even fucking know. I'm just talking out loud. But like that would be like a service game, and that could be nominated and win Game of the Year. And that won Game of the Year, I believe, when it came out. So Game Awards have a best ongoing game category, but the problem is almost all big games now have DLC, so they are destined to be in that category anyway. Right. It's very difficult because I don't know if it's very weird to say. Yeah, like, do we have like a distinction between service games, like having that content, and like single player releases that get like a DLC that comes out? I don't know. ORAM, what the fuck are you saying? I think you need to take down your review of Rebirth if you hate it this much. What the fuck did I just say that would make you think that? I'm sorry. Everything I just said, I just glazed Rebirth. What are you talking about? I literally just deep throated the game. I literally just said it is the exception to end all exceptions. What are you saying, bro? You're not normally like this. Are you okay? Is something going on? I promise you, my slob is still on reverse knob right now. I literally just said that like no other remake but Rebirth. What are you saying, man? Okay. Anyway, I just want to why also why the fuck is that like even a thing? Like some people are saying like, "Oh, you've turned on Rebirth." I'm like, "How the fuck I slob that game's knob every chance I get. I always say how much I love it. I'm still saying I just got done saying how much I love it." Anyway, um yeah, it was a good game. It was a good game. Do you think the snowboard minigame will be in part 3? I do. I don't think they'll cut it. I do think that Metaphor has a better chance of winning though than people give it credit for. I do follow a lot of journalists and have journalist mutuals, and you know a lot of them will end up being judges for this sort of thing, and they really fucking liked Metaphor. I mean, the Metacritic score it says as much. Are you far into Metaphor? Not deeply. I'm like 20 hours into it, so um ish. I think I don't know. Been a while since I opened it because I had to like my hour count on it is weird because I had to speed run the demo section, and so my hour count is like kind of fucking weird. So you have to add in like the section that I speed, but I'm pretty deep into it, or not that deep into it, deep enough into it. I do think that Metaphor winning is like plausible. If I'm to be honest, between Metaphor right now and Rebirth, it's a toss up, and I don't particularly care which one wins at the moment. That opinion may be informed differently by me beating Rebirth. I mean, not beating Rebirth, beating Metaphor. But currently, I think both of them are exceptional enough games, and yeah, it'd be great if either one of them wins. People get way too emotionally attached to games. One could say emotionally dependent instead. They attribute any critiques of the games as attacks on themselves and their character. I'll be blunt. It is odd, unhealthy. If you ever find yourself feeling this way, please go touch grass. That is not a good way to consume any media. Right. I think, yeah, I think that being personally identified to any media is probably coming from a place of like, um, some type of ostracization. I can't say the word. Ostracization. I can't fucking say it. Not being accepted, let's just say. Or better yet. There you go. Oh wait, did it even play? Did it play through the speaker? It should. But yeah, not healthy. No one should ever be that attached to media. I don't think the emotional attachment to any art is bad. It's more the failure to recognize that other people aren't you. Wow, that's actually a much better way of saying it. Thank you, Orthomatrix. I think that's the perfect way of saying it. I'll read that one more time. I don't think the emotional attachment to any art is bad. It's more the failure to recognize that other people aren't you. Beautifully said. Do you guys think that Black Myth Wukong will win? I don't think it will. I think that like if it was like purely decided by like vote, maybe. I don't think that's like how it's decided though. Journalists vote on it, and then I think they factor in like our votes as well. But that being said, I do think that it will be between Rebirth and Metaphor. I don't think it'll be as between that and Astrobot as people. I do think Astrobot will be in the running, but I don't know if Astrobot will win. I could be entirely wrong about that. I could be very wrong about that. But I do think that Rebirth and Metaphor will be taken pretty seriously. I think Metaphor has a better chance than people probably give it credit for. I also think too that a lot of Atlas fans versus FF7 fans, the worst thing that could have happened to the JRPG fandom. I mean, it is unironically what tribalism, right? Like it's tribalism at its weirdest hour. Because I don't think that there is, if anything, right? The tribe should be JRPGs, right? Like we have dominated. It should be like us against like I don't know what the fuck Helldivers 2, which might get nominated for Game of the Year, and also might be the dark horse for Game of the Year. Actually, it might be. In fact, if we're talking about the game that had the most influence and discussion and players and hype behind it, actually, Game of the Year might be Helldivers 2. Like, strictly logically speaking, Helldivers 2 might actually be the GOTY. Um, I'm sleeping on Tekken. I think Tekken would certainly be nominated. I don't see Tekken winning. As I think back on it, I don't know if a fighting game's ever even won. Helldivers 2 would unironically fully deserve it as well. That's what I'm saying, right? Like, we're over here talking about Metaphor, Astrobot, and Rebirth, but like, nobody talks about Helldivers 2, and I find that insane because the impact of Helldivers 2 is like out of this world during this year. It was like it was the game. And so I don't actually understand why Helldivers 2 isn't part of the discussion more. I think part of the reason that it's not is because the controversy with PSN and Sony. Yeah, Sony really did fumble it pretty bad. Sony fumbled it incredibly bad. But Helldivers is, I mean, it is certainly qualified to actually win Game of the Year for sure. The community and Arrowhead were beefing, right? I think that's the reason that it's not part of the discussion normally. Is because of how it fell off with the community beefing with the studio. Nobody is talking about Helldivers 2 because Jeff Keighley's awards are biased towards single player cinematic games. Well, that's based as fuck. Good. Keep it that way. So based. Yeah, Overwatch won. Yeah, I don't think that's the case either. I don't think that there is a bias toward, or in that way, a bias toward cinematic single player games versus multiplayer games. I don't think that bias. I think that like if there is any bias in that way, I think that multiplayer service games actually kind of dominate. Maybe it's just me, and maybe I'm speaking only to myself. But like every time someone asks me what kind of games do you play in real life, particularly in real life, it is always a question that they're really asking me, what multiplayer service game do I play? It is almost always that. It's never like what single player games do you play? They always kind of implicitly mean like what service multiplayer games do I play? And I like if I tell them I was like, oh, I like Nier and Persona and Final Fantasy, I like God of War, I like these sorts of games, they'll be like, oh, okay, cool. I play League. I play they'll be like, oh, I play Apex, Valorant, those sorts of games, and then we have nothing to talk about. So, I mean, if we're talking about like a vast majority of people, I think that like there is probably more favoritism. That's so true. They always sound disappointed when you say single player games. They do, bro. And guess what? I always am disappointed when they say like all their like multiplayer server shit. I'm like, yeah, I don't play any of that. I was like, you know, I like playing a game that ends. Or I tell them to check out a game and they'll ask me, oh, is it free? I'm like, no, fuck you, it's not free. It's $70. Pay for a full product. Goddamn. It's good when you pay for a complete thing. Is that a hot take? Because that's the hill I'll die on for sure. I don't want a free game. I want a complete game that I paid for. I mean, if you'll give it to me for free, I'd love a free game. But I don't want like a free to play free game. I want a complete release. And that's not to say that every free to play game is bad, but that's just to say my preference is for a finished game always. And like whenever it comes to a free to play game, it's always gonna like be going in there with the uh with kind of trying to basically surpass my bias, essentially. These people are allergic to the idea of interacting with thoughtfully made art rather than shoveling Fortnite emote slop down their. I mean, it's tough to say, right? This is what most kids are kind of being raised up on. Is they're being raised up on a game that they got for free and that they downloaded on their iPad. You know, all of these free games that are available for kids. And so, I mean, who could blame them growing up on that now? But it's also not just younger people, too. I feel like most people that I talk to in their 20s and 30s, I feel like most of them are saying, like, service games are pretty much what they play. Like, online, multiplayer, something is the vast majority of it. It's sad. We're dinosaurs, guys. We're a dying breed. And you know, too, especially being a content creator around a single player or different single player game series does kind of suck in a way because you do have moments where there is nothing happening. And I am envious of like game content creators who do cover a service game and they're able to just hop on the game and just play the game, stream the game, and then that's what they do. And they don't have to make like think pieces and shit like that to make content. I'm like, wow, that's so awesome. I'm so jealous, right? Like, you don't have to come up with a video like, could Final Fantasy X-3 be good? You don't have to like make opinions all the time and analysis all the time and have that be the content and then people judge your opinions and analysis of stuff. But you have to come up with opinions and analysis of stuff because that's the content, and so it's tough. If there was a multiplayer service game I was interested in, I would certainly make content around it, right? Like it's not like I wouldn't stop making like content around like my favorite single player games, but I would make content around like a multiplayer service game if there was ever one that I was like deeply invested in or like really intrigued by. Now that might be Persona 5 X. I guess it kind of was Final Fantasy 14, right? Like I was making FF14 content for a while pretty aggressively. Um but the only thing is though too about like keeping up with FF14 and um yeah, I'm just more of a single player Andy with that game. New Dissidia? Oh man. So this was actually kind of like my hope with Dissidia NT before it came out was that I was like, dude, I'm gonna lean all the way into Dissidia NT. I'm gonna do character breakdowns. I'm gonna like host my own tournament. I'm gonna be like hella into Dissidia NT, and then Dissidia NT came out, and it was Dissidia NT, and the rest is history. The rest is history. So yeah, shame NT was shit. I know. There's still a niche content creator for First Soldier. I mean, not anymore because First Soldier shut down. But there was a couple of people that were like First Soldier dedicated channels, right? What makes me so mad? The character models are so good, but the game sucks. The game really did suck. It was so bad. They made so many bad decisions with that game. It was just like mind blowing. And I think Square always gives like and Koei Tecmo too at this time just give like the lamest excuses too, like no story mode because story mode would have taken too much work. It's too long. We couldn't do it. It would have made the development longer. And I get it from like a dev perspective, but I'm like, damn, from a customer perspective, that just sounds like ass, bro. That just sounds fucking terrible. Like, Hello Goku, thank you so much Don't falter, NSP. Your work is appreciated here. Thank you so much, Hollow Goku. I appreciate that. You're the best. Yeah, so I would love for there to be the best thing NT gave us was that one screenshot or Sephiroth stood next to Xenos. Could you do me a favor and pull it up on stream for me again? I don't have it. If you have it, I'll pull it up. Maybe if I Google it. Oh wait, I found it on Google. That screenshot always cracks me up. That's like insane size difference, man. Sephiroth is not short, by the way. Sephiroth's like 6 feet tall. So how tall is Xenos? I have no idea, but I'm kind of terrified. Like, what the? He's like massive, right? Sephiroth is like 6'3" or something, right? Yeah, which means that Xenos is like at least 8 feet tall. Like bare minimum. Sorry for everyone who's not American. We're talking freedom units right now. Now imagine a Lalafell punching him in the fist in a fist fight at the end of the game. Yeah, that's amazing. Let me make sure I set that back. There we go. Xenos has to be 7'5" at the very least. I think Barrett is taller than Sephiroth, actually. He might actually be. Yeah, Duodecim was great. I agree, Carlos. Duodecim was the peak. And you know who did like Duodecim's combat? It was the same designer who did Kingdom Hearts 2's battle direction as well. I forget his name right now, but I feel like his work is so difficult to emulate. He's a lot like what Sakurai is for like Smash Bros, right? Where no one else can just come in and do his work. And so he is sorely missed on Dissidia NT. And I think that Osaka team with Kingdom Hearts 3, it took them until Remind in order to get Kingdom Hearts 3 feeling like halfway decent without him. He's so good at his job. Do you mean Takahashi-san? I think that's his name. Where is the KH2 battle director? Oh, you guys don't know? He's working on Remake. Actually. That's why Remake's combat is good. He works with Teruki Endo. No. His name is yeah, Takahashi. Mitsunori Takahashi. Yeah, this is the guy. Let's pull him up. You see this guy? His name is Mitsunori Takahashi. He is responsible for giving us for giving KH2 such an amazing battle system. He's the battle planner for FF7 Remake, and is worth putting a face to the name to, since I've heard people refer to him without mentioning who he actually is. Yeah. So this guy is like the god of Square Enix action combat. Like, when Square first started trying to do action combat, he was kind of the only guy that actually, at least as far as we know, seemed to like really know what he was doing. And he was like way ahead of the rest of the company when it came to building action battle systems. So and honestly, I still think that his battle system, his work is still really good. And again, now he's working with Teruki Endo on Remake. That's what he's currently doing. And so, long story short, if FF17 is sticking with action, I want this guy on it. I want this guy on it. And again, one thing I like about him in particular is that I feel like he is, how should I say, his style of combat has a unique feel to it that you could call a proprietary Square Enix action combat in like a good way. You know how FromSoft games have that FromSoft feel to it, like the way you hit the enemies and just the way everything feels. And non-FromSoft games try to emulate it, but there's always like something that's just like a little bit different about it that's not like the way that FromSoft would do it. You know what I'm talking about, right? I feel like his battle systems are the same way. And that's what people were talking about, like when they were talking about, oh, Tokyo team versus Osaka team. Yeah, it was really like how the battle systems that he worked on compared to the battle systems without him felt. And so, yeah, I think that his battle systems have a unique feeling to them that you could probably attribute to being like proprietary Square Enix action. Um, and I think that's what they need. Like a big part of like what they need is like something that's like, this is a game that feels like only Square Enix could make it, and not have that be like a derogatory thing, but have it be like a very uplifting, positive notion. That's kind of like my big thesis with like 17 and like everything going forward that they're going to make is that they just really need something that's unique. Like whatever 17 ends up being, it has to be like, okay, this is the game that nobody else is making. I think that's the fundamental most important thing for whatever they put out next is it just has to be like, okay, there is nothing else that plays like this. I think actually that may even be more important than iterating on re-trilogy battle system or doing anything else. Is just to say that it should feel like something that is uniquely Square, and then nobody else could do it. No, or nobody else would come up with it, right? Like it's our thing. That's the only way that they're going to get to the 10 million plus seller goal that they want. Job system plus rebirth framework. I think that's a winning ticket. And I mean, the reason I even pushed the rebirth framework or like the re-trilogy framework in the first place is because I think that they have a unique game style with re-trilogy that is worthy of being like its own genre of game. That you can mix up in infinitely different ways and it can feel fresh and new and it won't get old so long as you keep adding new fresh stuff to it. FF17 can't be too outside the box that it strays away from the Final Fantasy formula. Yeah, there's a line to toe. There's a line to toe. And I think that they used to be a lot more concerned with it than it seems that they are now, right? Because before, I mean, even like it was sort of like, oh, we can't do action because, that wouldn't be Final Fantasy. But then they did that, and then they did all these other things. And then now it's kind of like, well, what is the line for something? Like, what is the line for Final Fantasy, right? Like, what is it? Because at some point, if Final Fantasy is just literally anything, then what's the point of buying Final Fantasy? Because if it's just anything, then you don't own a thing, right? Does that make sense? Like you're not doing a specific thing, you're not meeting a specific need. It can just be whatever. Then then what's even the point? I could say like you could be like, oh, is Persona a Final Fantasy? Well, yeah, because Final Fantasy could be anything. So I'm gonna just say that Persona's Final Fantasy. I mean, after all, that goes back to the Octopath argument that we were having earlier, where it was like, oh, Octopath is a Final Fantasy. I'm like, well, if Octopath is a Final Fantasy, then you can just call any game a Final Fantasy. And like, what is the line at which point where we say, okay, this is not a Final Fantasy game. This is a Final Fantasy game. What keeps people to the brand? Like what is it about the brand that actually makes people play the games, right? Like it's because if anything can just be Final Fantasy, then what is the point of Final Fantasy? Because I can just pick up any game and just say, it's Final Fantasy. So, I have Final Fantasy 17 right here. Don't tell me that it's not Final Fantasy 17 because Final Fantasy can be anything. And so I've decided that, you know, it does have to be within some some boundaries. Final Fantasy has become more of a feeling. Things feel like FF. Well, then that's even more troubling in a way because you can't own a feeling, right? Like from a brand perspective, that's like deeply concerning because if that's the case, I can feel like Metaphor is a Final Fantasy and I get the feeling from it, and then it's meeting that need for me. So then why would I buy like the Final Fantasy thing? This is why the brand having some sort of identity is important, right? And this is why I talk about, at the very least have like a common like battle system that can be like shared like they used to have that yeah. And I mean, and honestly too, while it's not like what I would personally prefer necessarily, like even if they continued to go down the hack and slash route that like 16 is, well then okay, that's something that we can work with, and we could say that Final Fantasy is the ultimate fantasy hack and slash game. That's an easier brand to communicate and sell, and then okay, then we know what Final Fantasy is now. But now it's like I don't know what it is. Uh, Shiryu, can you? I see a lot of just like toxic messages coming from you. Can you calm down a little bit? Thanks. FF needs to have some core traits: party system, world map, hybrid command, battle system. You can then modify everything else. Yeah, yeah, exactly, right. And that's what it used to be, right? Like that was the style of game, right? And in fact, I would argue that that is such the style of game that is such an identifiably Final Fantasy thing that's why we can just so easily say, "Oh, Bravely Default, that's a Final Fantasy. Octopath Traveler is a Final Fantasy." Like you could just easily call those things a Final Fantasy, or say that it's like a Final Fantasy substitute because it has those core fundamentals. So it's actually funny that, like on a subconscious level, that is what people already identify as FF. Like whether they will consciously argue it or not, but then they'll say that all these other things, like if another JRPG that's not explicitly labeled Final Fantasy has those things, then people will be like, "Oh, it's an FF." And so that in itself says a lot. Are you still going to do an FF9 playthrough? I'll do an FF9 playthrough if and when the remake gets announced. You can call Bravely Default an FF because it's a game with FF5 job system, literally the exact same. 4 elemental crystals, evil empire summons, not the world. Right. And that's another thing too, is that see, there's a brand identity in there. There's a gameplay elements connecting it. There's themes connecting it. But at the same time, though, then you have to look back at Final Fantasy and say, if Final Fantasy is just like a vibe, then like they can't own a vibe, right? Like, you know, are you still playing Ever Crisis? No, I haven't touched it in a while. Some of the new content, like Young Angel and stuff like that, looks really cool. If Rebirth at 16 already got 87 plus Metascores, how good will 17 be if they improve all these systems? Right. Virality, I mean, that's kind of the biggest factor too, is that, um, you know, I also feel like, I mean, it's really just a game of, I don't know how to phrase what I want to say, so never mind. Crystals are arguably the only connection between the FF games, with one exception being two, but it's a vague concept with some games incorporate crystals as well, right? Um, I guess what I mean is that we can look at like 1 through 10 and we can see at least a sense of continuity. Actually, I'd say 1 through 12. Um, and hell, arguably to a large extent, even with 13, right? Like I still feel like there is like like that last bit of continuity that is still semi left, and then I think after 13, um, that continuity just kind of like disappears entirely. So I do think that there has to be something, right? Because if Final Fantasy is just a game called Final Fantasy and then there's nothing to it else that binds it, and I also understand that they may be even contradictory to how the creators feel about it, but I think that for a while that worked, but I think that right now in the modern AAA landscape, it's probably not going to work anymore. Um, People will deny it as much as they want, but FF13 is a fucking FF game. Did they execute well on it? No, but it is absolutely an FF feeling FF game. Right. Yeah, I wouldn't say that FF13 doesn't like feel Final Fantasy. I just feel like they just fucked up. It feels like an FF game that they fucked up making, but I can't say that like it doesn't feel like FF like at its core. Like 13 is still pretty FF. It's just a fucked up FF. But it's still FF for sure. Um, like I said, I do think that there does need to be lines that are drawn, right? Like I do think that you do have to say like party members, for example. FF is always a story about a group of characters that you can play as. I guess another thing too is that the counter argument that I hear sometimes from people is that that's just describing a good JRPG. And I feel like one, yes. Two, good JRPG has been basically defined by Dragon Quest and Final Fantasy. So, yeah. I mean, DQ and FF have literally outlined and standardized what people point to as as the core fundamental of what a good JRPG is. So, I mean, we get into circular logic there when we try to make that point. I get what they're saying, but it's also kind of like, you know, party, the world map, the style of command battles, like those games are like what made the genre like what it is in the first place. And every other game tried to emulate, you know, those games. And so they popularized the thing in the first place, and the airship in particular, you know. Dragon Quest, Final Fantasy, Phantasy Star, and Ys were the original pillars that set down a lot of what became the standard going forwards, right? And so just to say like, oh, that's just what a good JRPG is, and I'm like, well, who set the standards for like what a good JRPG is? One of those games was definitely FF, and so yeah, that is what a good JRPG is. Thanks to Final Fantasy, who popularized that idea, those ideas in the first place, you know, or helped, was a huge part of it. So, you know, yes, that is what a good JRPG is, but that's also like what a good Final Fantasy is. But also too, you know, if we're just defining that as like what a good JRPG is, and Final Fantasy doesn't have it, then we're also inadvertently defining Final Fantasy as something that's not a good JRPG. So there's also that argument to think about as well, right? So we need to be careful to just to not be like, well, every JRPG has that, or well, good JRPGs have that, but then FF doesn't have that. Something that everything should have, or like is supposed to have, or like the qualifier of good is part of that, and then it doesn't have that, right? Like, so hope they do something really good with the airship in FF7 Part 3. Again, you know, that's kind of why I stress building off of Retrilogy in particular, is not to say that Retrilogy got everything perfect and they don't need to change anything at all. They just need to make new content on top of their existing tech, and then it's fine. Everything is perfect. It's totally not to say that, right? When I say build off of Retrilogy, what I specifically mean is that with Retrilogy, they have a functional airship working now, right? Or they will have it when Part 3 releases. They have a world map system. They have a battle system that includes party members, summons, and controlling all of those party members, right? Like the core things that FF fans all specifically want. And not only do FF fans want those things, in terms of the broader gaming landscape, if I can show someone a big RPG where you can fly an airship and there is multiple playable characters and all these other things, dude, that's a damn cool game. That's a game that stands out. That's a game that's not like every other RPG on the market, right? So, if they can take whatever Part 3 is, right, and just not just like, you know, be like, okay, we're just gonna redo the same thing, but build on top of that again, right? Like, you know, some people felt like things were too checklisty in Rebirth. So take the element of Chatley, right? And take Chatley out of the picture. Of course, Chatley wouldn't be in the picture for FF17, but take Chatley away from the design concept. And for FF17, how are we going to make the side content work when there's not like a central figure like Chatley? Okay, well, we're going to do all this other stuff. And you'll be able to. One of the things that I thought would be really cool was like, what if you found summons out in the world map, right? And they weren't just marked or anything like that. You could dynamically like find Odin out in the wild or something like that. But you still have like the world map structure of Rebirth. I think that would be really cool. So if they can change up, you know, a lot of people didn't like the Ubisoft Tower stuff. They can change up like how you discover things and really do something interesting with the world map. Maybe not as many games for FF17, although I think they should have some type of card game, some type of Queen's Blood like thing, because that was just really fun in Rebirth. So they can bring back some type of mini game like that. I would have plenty of mini games, but not as many mini games as Rebirth. I would have a focused number of mini games. So Queen's Blood was a banger. I would have like, instead of all the mini games that Rebirth has, I would have maybe like 3 or 4 mini games and I would have them all fuck as hard as Queen's Blood does. I'd have it just focused on the mini games that are really good, have a lot of replayability that you can do with them, a lot of different scenarios that can happen with them that are really engaging, right? Like everyone loves playing Queen's Blood. I could play Queen's Blood the whole game. That's really easy to do. So if you can do that, you see what I'm saying? There's a foundation there. And you can make something that's very different, very interesting. There were definitely too many smaller mini games in Rebirth, like way too many, right? And I mean, like, yeah. See, I would only have like the bigger ones. I would have like the, um, what do you call it? What's the fucking name of that mini game? It's in the original game too. Why can't I think of it right now? It was harder in Rebirth for some reason. Why is it slipping my mind? Anyway, you guys know the one I'm talking about. Fort Condor, yes. I don't know why I couldn't think of Fort Condor. My brain is not working today. I'm running a little slow. Yes, like just have like Queen's Blood and Fort Condor and like two other mini games, right? Like mini games that you can play throughout the whole game. So yeah, I would just focus on that and having an airship and doing those sorts of things, and that's what I think would be solid. And I think that they should continue on with Unreal Engine because that's what helped them make Rebirth so fast. Fort Condor wasn't as good as Integrate though, right? Yeah, it wasn't. Integrate's version of Fort Condor was way better. Yeah, so 17 should just have less mini games, but it should have focused mini games. But there definitely should be mini games. I would just make it a smaller number and make them better. And make them something that the player will want to keep going back to. And Queen's Blood, I think, already gets exactly there. Yeah, Chatley is going to have like a weird ass twist in part three, and it's either going to be really interesting or really cringe. And I don't think that there's any in between on like what's going to happen with him. It's literally going to be one or the other. Chatley is either going to be like this weird thing that's like everyone's like, oh my god, I can't believe they did that, or it's going to be like, holy crap, I can't believe they did that. And I don't think that Charlie is going to be something that people are like apathetic about by the end. I think they are going to do something big with him. But how will I cope without a shitty little mini game about setting robot AI so I can find out that Wedge is dead? The fact that they did that with Wedge though is like so. I really hated that. I really hated that because I feel like Wedge just he just should have had the moment in remake, right? It should have just been like Wedge died. I don't know why they literally only allowed Wedge to live 5 feet longer, or like five, or like him like live like or die like 5 feet away from like where he normally would. That's not what I mean. My brain is not working today. I mean, they allowed him to live for like a few more minutes of screen time. They didn't give him much more. He like got to like find his cat or some shit, and then that was it. It was so dumb. They like just completely screwed up with like Wedge's death. I feel like I did not see a point in changing it in the way they did. I guess it's safe for me to say now that the arbiters sucked ass, right? Like I can say that and it not be like a big deal. I can say that and not get like ratioed in my ass beat anymore. Like, is that like it's not a hot take anymore, right? Like for me to just say that the arbiters were not a good idea. I think that's like okay to say out loud. I think it is. What I really want in part three is less VR environments. I want them to use the overworld for super bosses more. I don't think that part three will dial back on the VR environments. It's going to keep the VR. However, that's something that Final Fantasy 17 that is building off of this game can do. And it could be like no VR. We're going to rework everything from VR to fit into the world itself, right? And so that's why I said that, like, what if instead of finding summons throughout the world and doing the mini game, you're like literally finding the summons out in the world, right? Like you find like a wild Shiva, and then you have to challenge Shiva, and then she'll be like a summon for you. The Arbiters were always stupid, even when people thought they were the purest fans. And there was that whole debacle. They have been a shitty crutch narrative IMO, a literal Deus Ex Machina that is used way too liberal. Yeah, I remember people were very like huge defenders of them. They were like, the Arbiters are the fans who like wanted the game to stay the same. Well, the Arbiters won kind of in Rebirth, I would say then, because the Arbiters definitely kept most things the same. But then the third part is also going to be kind of different, right? Because the expectations that the Arbiters left and what we're getting from the games is not really aligned to me. It's not congruent at all. The Unknown Journey, my ass. See, okay, I want to say that at the end of Rebirth, the way they left off really makes you think that part three is going to be insanely different. But then part one also did that for part two, where I thought Rebirth was going to be really different. And so I don't know. I don't know if that's like, if that's the case. Can you explain this? Why was Zach visiting the church at the end of Integrate? But that scene was not referenced at all in Rebirth. That's a great question. I've seen people asking that, and the only thing I could like, the only thing I can come up with is different timeline. Because yeah, that scene doesn't even fit into like what we saw of Zack in the Terrier timeline. So yeah, all I can say is yeah, uh, like different timeline, different dog. It was the Shiba Inu dog and the corgi, and we just don't know it yet until yeah. I don't know. I don't know. I do think that the theory stuff surrounding Seven, or like a lot of the new stuff surrounding it, has been like the weakest part of it for me so far. But I don't think that's a surprise. I've kind of been fairly consistent on that for like 4 years now. So it has been so for me. It shows potential sometimes, but then it never really gets to a point where I'm like, oh, this is genius. And I feel like in order for it to get to a point where I feel like it's genius, I have to do a lot of the writing myself, if that makes sense. So I have to do like a lot of the theory crafting and stuff. So I don't feel like the Arbiters and the new twist there have really like felt like a superbly genius, like mind blowing thing. The strength of Re-Trilogy's writing has like come from the character moments and seeing Cloud and Tifa and Barrett and Aerith and the gang just interacting and them having their moments and how they've preserved certain scenes and certain feelings and stuff like that. That's really been the genius of Re-Trilogy's writing. And I just don't think thus far it's really been the new mystery or the arbiters or whatever they're trying to do here to make this a meta story. It just hasn't gotten to that point for me yet. And I thought too, I was very surprised how many other people kind of also ended up feeling that way. I don't think I was as surprised when I finished Rebirth because like man, I when I finished Rebirth and I saw that ending, I was like, oh my god, that is going to be controversial, right? Like, imagine being like one of the first few people to see the ending to Rebirth in the world. Um, and you know, if you're a reviewer, you have like NDA, you can't really talk to anyone about it. So just being like one of the first few people to see that, and you're just sitting on it for like a little while because no one else has seen that ending, and you're just like, oh, I'm like, oh man, legit. I didn't know how people were gonna react to it. Um, I tried talking to some other reviewers, and they were also like, everyone was just like, "Yeah, we have no idea. We have no idea how people are gonna feel about this." So it was like really hard to gauge it, right? Because I mean, at the time, a lot of reviewers also thought that part one's story was gonna like have a sort of negative backlash to it too, and it did for a couple of days. But then, as a lot of the theory crafting came out, you had like Max, you had like Sleep Easy, and they were putting out like really just like exceptionally good content on the game. A lot of people's barometers kind of changed on how they felt about it. They became increasingly more warm to it. Um, but yeah, as things as time went along, Remake's reception got a lot warmer for its ending. But I feel like for Rebirth, it's gone like two different directions. So I feel like there are still some people who love the way Rebirth ended, and I feel like there's people that really hate the way Rebirth ended. And I do think that Rebirth's ending is probably more divisive than Part One's ending, which is interesting. But that's also kind of like what I predicted too, right? Is that like I was kind of like what I foresaw happening with Part One. I was like, well, Part One, all Part One says is that we're going to be doing something different with Final Fantasy VII, right? And for most people, it's hard to hate that. In fact, it's easy to say that like, oh, anyone who doesn't like that is is the bad guy basically because you don't want them to try a new thing. So you're bad. Let them try new things. Let them be ambitious. Those sorts of things, right? So, and also too, we don't know what the change was yet. We don't know what was going to happen. Zack is maybe alive. Maybe there's timelines, but like you could just copium your way around it. And so, um, the reason part one's ending got a lot more love probably than Rebirth was that whatever you wanted from Final Fantasy VII Re-Trilogy to be, part one's ending allowed you to think that. So if you thought it was a faithful remake, it's still going to be. If you thought it was going to be a sequel, then it's going to be. You think they're going to change everything, then yeah. You think they're not going to change much, then that's what's happening. So you could just tell yourself that whatever you want it to be is going to be. And there is probably a way to read the evidence to support it. And then I felt like some people who were in denial about it when the ending of part two happened, then they were kind of like, okay, yeah, this is what they're doing. um, okay, serious question about theory crafting. I genuinely feel like the devs are leaning way too much into it, and it is only going to impact the legacy of the games negatively in the years after the hype dies down. When new fans come across the games and don't get to experience YouTubers deep diving and theory crafting and playing the cat and mouse with the devs, it may feel great in the moment for the people deep in the sauce, but it won't last. Crossy, man. That's been like the thesis that I've had with the series for like 4 years. And that's like what I've been trying to warn about. I'm like, it is fun and exciting. I love having like, our content creator friends on here for the stream and like us talk about it. And like, it's so much fun to like just kind of like discuss like where it could go. But I'm like, discussing like where it can go is like really fun. But how are we gonna feel after it did go there? You know what I'm saying? Like that was the kind of foresight that I was having on the situation was that like yeah, it's fun to theory craft, it's fun to do all that other stuff. But remember, the most fun part is to having like that piece of art that stays. You know what I'm saying? Like it's like permanently there and made you feel a thing because the reveals are big. And also too, the other thing about mystery boxes are like this style of like storytelling, the black box mystery, is that proportional to how long it takes to reveal what's in the box, people's expectations rise. And so the longer that it takes to reveal the mystery, the more mind blowing people expect the mystery to be. That places a very heavy burden on part three because now part three, the truth behind the mystery of like what's actually been really going on with Final Fantasy VII is insanely high, absurdly, because we've been like, it's been like years now, right? It'll be like a full decade, I believe, like once or close to a decade. Um, once it comes, well, not quite. Games will have come out like within a span of like maybe like 7 years if it comes out in 2027, 2020, 2024, 2027. So yeah, people expect a lot from the mystery box, and it's going to be hard for it to deliver something that blows people's minds, especially because look at all the theory crafters, right? Like everyone turned into a theory crafter and everyone had a different theory. I think it would have been fine if there were only two parts and they were right next to each other, and it didn't take as long, and we got that mind-blowing reveal within like the next few years, right? But the fact that it's going to be like close to a decade that we've been sitting on it, right? That's going to make it a little tougher for people to feel like really satisfied with it. And also, too, just statistically, someone's had to get pretty close to like whatever the answer is. I'm sure if Baby Seal was here, he would say that it was him. Um, just statistically speaking, someone's had to get pretty close to wherever part three is, or like wherever like the core mystery of like remake, rebirth is. Because there's only so many ways that this thing can go. And so, as a result of that, some people won't be as surprised. Some people will just be like, "Oh, this is the exact thing I expected." I'm like not shocked at all. Anyway, this was the shit that I tried to like communicate when part 1 came out. To be fair, I didn't do a good job of it. Um I hadn't really honed my ability to communicate contentious takes in a way that allowed people to reasonably understand what I was saying, even though it's not the popular thing to say. I think I'm a little bit better at it now. Only a little bit, because I still have stuff happen where people just heinously don't understand like what the fuck I'm trying to say. And then they come to agree with me later. And then I'm like, oh my fucking God, well, I said that before. And then, but anyway, anyway, um, Ruger, thank you so much for the super chat. Isn't it crazy that we basically know for certain at this point, SC regrets making FF7, remaking FF7. Who would have thought that 10 years ago? I mean, I don't. Yeah, financially regrets probably, because they're locked into like 3 games. I don't think it's tough, right? Because we always did have like the meme about breaking the glass in case, if Square Enix ever goes bankrupt, they can just remake Final Fantasy VII and they'd be back in The black's the profitable one. I don't I almost said the red, the green. They'd be back in the black. And I don't think that's quite the way things have gone. I don't know. I wouldn't I don't know if I'd call the remakes like a financial failure or anything yet, because we haven't seen like the sales from them. But we'll see. I have a feeling that Rebirth may have sold a little bit more than people are thinking. But yeah, I think that they don't regret remaking Final Fantasy VII so much as they may now have rethought how they would approach remaking Final Fantasy VII. So I think that if they were going to remake Final Fantasy VII, knowing what they knew now, if they knew that years ago, they would have approached it like it would have been like a duology, right? It would have been like two games, probably. Two games the size of Rebirth, and they probably would have marketed it a lot differently. And also, they would have done it earlier, because the right time to remake Final Fantasy VII was on PlayStation 3. The problem is that who would have trusted Square Enix PlayStation 3 to make a Final Fantasy VII remake? I wouldn't have. But timing wise, that's when FF7 had like the most power. But I do think that I don't yeah, I wouldn't say they probably regret it necessarily, but I think they would definitely probably financially regret how they approached it. Midgar should not have been 30 hours. I think that was like the big problem, right? Like, could you imagine how differently things probably would have played out if Rebirth was the first game instead of the second game? And it came out like a few years earlier. Yeah, people would have been talking about that game way different, I feel like. So yeah, I think that it wasn't that remaking Final Fantasy VII was a bad idea. Um, but I think that one, they may have started on it a little too late, and CyberConnect 2 having to fire them definitely made it take place later. I think that they definitely should not have done 3 parts. I think they should have done 2. Um, I think 2 just makes more sense, and that should have been it. And then if they wanted to do a third game, like if the first 2 games were successful, they could have made Final Fantasy VII too, and that could have been the third game. I actually think that would have generated more interest too, by the way, for the third game. If the first 2 games were like these are like retellings of Final Fantasy VII, and then the third game is actually like Final Fantasy VII 2. Or yeah, or like a playable remake of Advent Children. I think that probably would have worked out a lot better. It sucks though. Because at the end of the day, despite everything I said, I still like kind of love Retrilogy. Like as I play it, there is still a part of me that's like teenage Ryan would like his mind would explode looking at this, playing this game. Like this is like the ultimate video game that he had been waiting for forever. It is like everything that he hoped for in like almost all regards. Um, so yeah, even despite all that, I still love Retrilogy. I'm still glad it's here. It's not perfect in some regards. Like, you know, a lot of the new story stuff again, I'm just like, this just would have been better with this not here outright. Like I cannot, but you know, even still, like I have to say, the games are pretty fucking good, and they're probably the best thing that's happened to Final Fantasy in terms of just brand faith, in terms of like I can tell someone to play this game and I know it's a good game, and it's not just like my Final Fantasy biased. Like, you know what I'm saying? Like, it's like, oh, I can just tell. I would only think that this is a good game because I'm a Final Fantasy fan. I think that you can sit the game in front of like any person, and they can play FF7 remake, and they'll probably think the game is pretty fucking awesome. But that's also why I hate the Arbiter shit. Like, that's also why that like infuriates me to no end, because I'm like, that's when like the game becomes so esoteric and niche and like wrapped within itself that I'm like, you ruined kind of like the best part for me, which is that I could just hand anyone this game and tell them to play it, and then they're like are completely into Final Fantasy VII. I'm like, now there's this wall where people are very confused and thrown off by um the meta narrative stuff, and then they have to go down a rabbit hole for that, and yeah. I think the meta narrative thing, by the way, would have worked if this game was made for PlayStation 3. Like 10 years ago when or oh god, it's more than 10 years ago now. Like it's more than 14, like 16 years ago. God, like 16 or 17 years ago when like Final Fantasy 7 um a hype and like love was like at like its greatest, like, and people were obsessed with the idea of a remake, and like everyone was like everyone was still like, you know what I'm saying, like people that grew up with Final Fantasy would be going from like being either young kids or teens to adults in their 20s to teens, and they would be buying Final Fantasy 7 remake, and I think it would have sold more than any Final Fantasy game ever. And yeah, my friend thinks Re-Trilogy is not a sequel. I mean, that's fair. Like, I'd say like half of people think it's not, and the other half think it is. But I think that regardless of if it is like literally a sequel or isn't a sequel, it is still esoteric enough that it feels like you're missing something if you haven't played Final Fantasy VII. And another huge problem is that the narrative around the game is that you're missing something if you haven't played Final Fantasy VII, right? So then I don't want to play it. And I don't know about you guys, but like I wouldn't say this is the case with every remake, but for a lot of remakes, there's a part of me that wants to go play the original first before I play the remake. And then somehow a lot of times that keeps me from ever playing the remake. But I feel like I always need to play like the original game or like a little bit of the original game before I play the remake, because then I'm like, well, how will I appreciate the remake if I don't play the original? And I think that like, not everyone is like that, but I think that like whenever you enforce that as the norm and that becomes a standard part of the narrative, it just puts up a barrier for people playing. So, what's the issue? Is Square Enix just expecting every game to sell like sliced bread? I know this is a hot take. I was watching another content creator's video recently, and they were talking about, inflated expectations, and the problem is just that Square Enix expects too much. Um, I guess that's a common sentiment, and it started like around like the Tomb Raider era, and that's where people, got the meme from, is that Square's like inflated expectations. However, and maybe this is a hot take, live up to the namesake of the stream. I don't think that their expectations for recent Final Fantasy games are inflated or anything. I think that they are not meeting the expectations that they have in a fair and reasonable way. And I say that in part because in almost 30 years, Final Fantasy has not had a new best-selling title. That is a problem in its own right. But then on top of that, when we have each game costing more to make and also each game selling less, then there's an issue somewhere down the line, right? Like the series is becoming less popular and is becoming less profitable too. And it's not to be alarmist, but there is a problem there, right? Objectively, that's an issue for any capitalist entity. So, Ruger, thank you for the super chat again. CPU 1 needs to cut out the side quest and minigame bloat and have a solid formula. CPU 3 has major issues to fix, like combat, lack of party members, etc. I mean, for sure. It's why I say, like, to build on re-trilogies stuff rather than to build on 16 stuff. Not to say that you can't build on 16 stuff. It's just to say that, like, when you finish FF7R Part 3, all the stuff that they're going to have, engine-wise, tech-wise, design-wise, is going to be, like, way far ahead of, like, what, like, 16's engine and stuff is going to have to be like, right? Because, like, 16, for example, doesn't even have, like, party members factored into its battle system and stuff. So they would actually have to do a lot more work to build on the 16 to get it to the point of where Re-Trilogy already is. So it just makes more sense to build on Re-Trilogy than it does to necessarily build on top of 16. And that's not to say that CPU3 can't build on 16 on their own time, but it's just to say that CPU1 or whoever is doing 17 should probably, just stack on top of, like, what we got here with Re-Trilogy and then just take it in its own direction, add its own flavor, really mix things up and make it fresh. That just seems to be more sensible to me. Because a lot of people will assume, well, it's just, it's because you don't like 16 that you feel that they shouldn't build on top of it. I'm like, no, that's not necessarily the case. It's just that it building on top of it is going to take tremendous amount of work. And then even when you do, you still wouldn't have as much done by the end of it as you would have by, like, what's already done with Re-Trilogy. So there's an issue with CB3 making another console game. They'd have to keep using their current engine share with the architecture as 14. I would say that CPU3's biggest issue right now is their quest design. CPU3's quest design has got to go. And I don't just mean 16. I mean 14 too. Like, for FF14, like with Dawn Trail, like, people hit the breaking point with Dawn Trail. They were just like, enough. And I was kind of surprised too, but, like, at the same time, not really, because at the same time, not really, because, Dawn Trail's story wasn't received as well, per se, as Endwalker or Shadowbringers or, Heavensward or any of those titles. And so, the quest design for 14 is, like, really covered up by the exceptional story that 14 has. And so if you have some people that don't, like, passionately love the story that's being told, then they're going to start to notice the quest design a lot more. And I think that happened in particular with Dawn Trail, and why that quest design was kind of the breaking point. And then also too, we had Final Fantasy 16 that also used that same questing style. And people were just kind of like, can you not do, like, another style of questing? Right? It kind of began to highlight a weakness in the team's game design, where people felt like there was not a better way for CPU3 to do their quest design. So I do hope that CPU3 for 14 in the future, if CPU3 works on 17 or 18 or any other titles, yeah. This might be a hot take, but I think Yoshida is part of the problem. He's excellent at making games efficiently in both finances and time, but that creates a formula which stifles creativity. Right. Creating a formula is good in reason. It's why I push for FF to have some sort of formula again, like it used to. The problem, I think, though, with CPU3 is just that they have created too strict of a formula. Like, it's very precise, Final Fantasy 16 structurally, and in like a lot of ways, felt like a 14 expansion, which is good for 14, but like for a single player game, it's like whoa, like for this to like feel exactly like an expansion, and for the DLCs to even feel like raids, you know, um, it's like they have everything down to a exact science, but the problem is that it produces a very similar product on a loop, right? And so, yeah, 16 very much felt like more 14 in terms of the structure of the game. In fact, if you really think about it, even the hideout was kind of like the hub world, like the way the hub city for for like 14 expansions, right? Because you know how there's always like a hub city, and then you go out and you teleport out into the world. Yeah, exactly. And so, yeah, 16 structure is like very verbatim 14's structure. And yeah, I think that was a breaking point for some with Dawn Trail, was that, coming off of 16, it's like, damn, dude, like 3 years in a row, same questing structure. I played this the same questing structure, and it didn't really deviate much. Well, hubs are not unique to 14 or 16. I just mean like in general, like the structure itself. I know that hubs are not unique to like 14 or 16, but it did kind of feel like the way that 16 used them was like all too similar to like the way 14 uses it. It's the way CBU3 uses hubs. That's exactly it. Yeah. Like, and I think that's like the biggest thing for CBU3's like new game for me is, or whatever they work on next, is just that I just want to see some new quest design. Nothing can get me more excited for 8.0 for 14 is to say like we're shaking up quest design like a major way. Um the new WoW expansion's got some amazing quest design. That's interesting. Cuz I remember before, like previously, people were like, "Oh, like 14's quest design's better than WoW's." And so now to know that WoW has maybe better quest design in its new expansion is also really interesting. Yeah, I think the party of FF should keep moving on a journey, not going back and forth constantly to a hub. I think that's a fair statement to make, because that's usually how FF games are structured. They tend to be structured like moving toward a destination. I think, yeah, like if there is gonna be a hub, it should be the airship. Low key, kind of agree. I thematically understand like why 16 didn't have an airship, but I do think it would have been cool if it had one. Like, if that did happen, like you did take the airship to fight Ultima, I would have really enjoyed that. I get why they didn't want to include it. I kind of disagree with the reason why they didn't want to include it, although I get what they were trying to argue. But I still think that they probably should have included the airship, because I think ultimately the reason they didn't was because Mid had essentially said that if there was an airship, it would essentially be used for war. I like another tool for war. But I also kind of think about it too, and I'm like, the airship also could have been like reframed as man breaking free from magic using science in the way that Sid kind of pushed for man to do, and like, you know what I'm saying? Like this kind of triumph away from magic, because science versus magic was kind of a theme they were pushing there, and so I guess you could have also reframed airships as like this great work of science against the grade of magic. And then having that work of science flying to Ultima, who is, you know, the ultimate kind of like magical thing or user or desire or person who crave magic the most. I don't know. You guys know what I'm getting at. Okay, but going from a magic reliant society to an airship, something that took humanity 1,000 years to do, is kind of a jump, yeah. I think it could have been like a symbol of progress, though, right? Like it could have been like a symbol of like, this is the world no longer magically reliant. This is the power of our engineering. A society that doesn't have to rely on slaves in order to um, do great things, right? To be able to sail the skies. I think it could have thematically worked if they wanted it to. I understand the idea that Mid had for like Mid was having like the Oppenheimer moment. She was like, if I invent this, it's gonna be like a tool used for war. But part of me, didn't like that because at the same time, do we not progress in technology because that technology will be used for war potentially? Right? Like, do we not invent the internet because people might get hacked? Do we not invent gunpowder because gunpowder will be used for war, etc.? And so I think that was kind of the issue that I had with it. But Ruger, thank you for another super chat. My hot take for CPU3 is that their formula was always boring, Quest in a Realm Reborn boring, and it's still boring in 16 Danjo. I get what you're saying. It was not quite the best, but I mean that's kind of how MMOs were, right? Like that's like what you expect for an MMO. And so I don't think it was that bad necessarily. I had a lot of fun playing A Realm Reborn back in the day. Uh, but yeah, I do think that their quest design is expected to evolve at this point for sure. I think that would be great. We went into World War II with bolt action rifles and came out with nuclear. That's fair. Did you play the original FF14? I did. My character has her tattoo, legacy tattoo, on her trap. Shadowbringer's quests were good though. Yeah. Well, it's the writing that made them really good. Yeah. So I don't know. I don't think that like I don't think that it was necessarily the case that like they had to make it not work for that reason. I think that they just decided that that's what they wanted to say instead of saying it. But um, philosophically, I'm not sure I agree with the game unless maybe someone could explain it to me in a different light. But like, just to say that like, I mean, airplanes were also used in war. So should we not invent airplanes because airplanes would be used for war? Right? Like, that's kind of the conclusion that Mid came to, is that we shouldn't invent planes because planes will be someone will figure out how to strap a gun to a plane and then it'll be used for war. And I just feel like, well, then humanity can never have anything. We can't have nothing. Um, because we'll use it for war, but I'm like, but then, philosophically, like what does that do for the world? You know what I'm saying? Like I I don't like it. I don't like the that idea. That was not for me. That wasn't a very thought provoking idea. I had a lot of contention with it because I think that if the answer is don't progress because that progress will be used for bad stuff and not like how do we change our culture so that humanity doesn't do the bad thing in the first place is basically kind of reductive because it kind of says that let's not progress as human beings because we might use it to hurt each other, you know? And the airplane analogy, I mean, that's like the most fitting analogy I can think of because literally, airplanes are definitely used for war, but they're also used for helping people travel and they change the world and they're a core part of society now and it's good that we have IRL airships, planes that can fly people around even though unfortunately they are used for terrible things just like cars, cars have also taken lives too, but for the most part cars have dramatically improved the quality of life for human beings. So do we not have car? I don't know. Maybe I'm reading it wrong, and I'm open to the idea of being wrong. But like, just reading it as a flat statement, it does feel very like WTF. I don't get it. For me. Um, do you like 15 or 16 more? I think 16 undeniably has better combat and undeniably is a more finished game and probably has a lot better story moments to it too. There are some elements of 15 I like more though, even still. Like I do think that 15 maybe better captures the FF adventure more than 16. Just the idea of going on with like the road with four warriors of light and um trying to get the crystal back and having like a road trip around the world. And so in some ways, I do think that FF15 kind of had the better FF adventure, like the core FF stuff to it in that way. But I think that 16 in terms of combat, in terms of like big story moments that probably resonate with people, spectacle for sure, being a complete game. 16 is a lot better for sure. But that's not to say that it's better in like all aspects where I feel like 15 has some intangible qualities to it that are better than 16 for sure. Just like I said, like the general FF adventure that you get from 15 and there's a lot more to kind of explore and do in 15 that feels less repetitive. And as bad as some of 16's side quests can be, I do feel like 15's side content is somehow a little bit better and more intriguing to interact with. That being said, 16 side quests have way better writing in them for sure, and so 16 side quests are more interesting story wise, but going around 15's world and doing 15's content is more interesting than doing 16. 16's just has a better story to it. Rooker, thank you so much for the super chat again. 16 Metacritic is higher than audience reception. I mean, that's not terribly surprising for me because, uh, of course, there's going to be some people who feel very extreme about a game that changed as much as it did. So there's also going to be people that really love and defend it. So and it's got like an 8.4 audience score. That's pretty good. That's about like what I expect. Oh, I didn't know there was a PC Metacritic score for it. The PC Metacritic score is at 84. Why is that? Why did someone give it like a... Oh, someone gave it a 61. Oh, it's mostly because of the performance. That makes sense. What do you think CPU 3 is doing outside of 14 right now? I don't know. That's actually a really big question. I don't think they're working on 17. I don't think. I think, well, they're definitely working on Tactics Remastered and Fantasian. But there has to be something that the 16 team is working on. I think it's so early that you can't really tell if it's a new IP or not. I think that they should be working on a new IP. Like if I had to pick something for them to be doing. Because I feel like Yoshi P in particular, I mean, he's even said it so much himself before. I'd have to find the interview where he said that his taste and Final Fantasy don't necessarily align most of the time. And so I feel like he should just be working on like a new IP. And I feel like he'd have a lot more freedom there. And so, yeah, I would hope that he would be able to get his own new IP and to be able to work on that. And maybe he can build off of Final Fantasy 16's combat style. And that's what I think that CBU3 should be doing. Yeah, Ryota Suzuki is still working at Square Enix, and they're not going to just waste Ryota Suzuki, you know, one of the most talented individuals in the industry. They're not just going to sit on him like that. He's working on something. I think the smartest thing CBU3 could do is make their own new IP. Right? Like, think about it. Atlas, for example, I know people get mad whenever you compare Metaphor and Final Fantasy in any capacity, but Atlas, for example, they could have just made more Persona, right? Like, Kashino could have made Persona 6, right? Like, it would have been easy. But they decided to make a new IP. And even though it's a very adjacent IP, Metaphor is still going to have its own fans, and people are going to get into it. And yeah, Atlas now successfully has created the third pillar. So I think the smart thing to do is that I mean, again, I'd have to look up the interview. Actually, I think it was in like the interview where he talked about wanting to make like a Bloodborne like game. And that I think that was the interview where Yoshi P talked about how his taste and like, you know, what's kind of expected of Final Fantasy don't often align. And I feel like that's fine. But I feel like him creating kind of a new IP then, because there are a lot of people who really loved Final Fantasy 16, right? It's not like I don't think that I think it has like its own like really strong following. And I think the smart thing to do is to build on that for people who love FF16. And I think the best move that they can do is to shift that into its own IP, right? And that will allow it to kind of like be its own thing and not have to like have the burden of Final Fantasy on it. And they can kind of make new things that feel like, you know, what the CBU3 flavor is, and they can have their own taste. I already know people who don't like Persona but are loving Metaphor. Yeah, exactly. So I do think that they should build on 16, but I think that they should build on it as like its own new IP that's not restricted to Final Fantasy. And I think that, they did successfully build some solid fandom with Final Fantasy 16. There's a lot of people again who really love that game. And I don't think that they should just abandon yet again a fandom of people they created who like a certain system and just leave them with nothing else, right? Like build on it. But I think the best way to build on it though is just like with the new IP. Um Rather than just making FF17 like another game like that. Cuz I think that like yeah, I've seen some people that are really crazy over FF16, they're new fans too. Right. Yeah, there's some new fans to it. There are people that really like it. It's not personally my jam, but yeah, I think it's very fair to say, pure observation of mine, that there's a lot of people that do love it. I do think that continuing that with like its own IP is like the most valuable thing that Square Enix can do. Two reasons for that. The first, again, uh, they need to stop pump and dumping combat systems like they always do in types of gameplay. And the second thing is too is that it allows that to continue and have the freedom away from the restriction and the expectations of the Final Fantasy brand, right? I think a game that built off 16 should be way shorter, but yeah, 16 itself should have been way shorter. I mean, if people like FF16, how are you going to get them to follow that type of game to a new IP? I mean, the same way you got Persona fans to follow to Metaphor, right? I don't think that there's a shortage of Persona fans who aren't picking up Metaphor or aren't aware of it now, you know? So, I mean, all the Persona fans followed Metaphor to Metaphor, or they followed it to, you know what I'm saying? So I think they'd find it. You tell them it's the same team, and also Square just needs new IP, right? Like Square doesn't really have a breakout new IP. They keep trying and they keep failing. That was supposed to be for Spoken, and then that game failed terrible bad. Oh god, it failed horribly. They keep trying other stuff like Foam Stars and all these other things. And so, yeah, take 16, I think, make it like a brand new IP. Take 16's combat and make a brand new IP around that combat and have it be like Square Enix's ultimate hack and slash fantasy game. And I think that would be really solid. People see studio names and staff and are automatically willing to give something a chance. Yeah. I mean, that's why a lot of us were excited for 16, right? Is that we just saw like Yoshi P, Ryota Suzuki, Soken, like those people. And we're like, okay, I'm in. Say less. Say less. So it doesn't take much. Okay, I think we're going to call it a stream there. And then let me see. Let me see something real quick. Yeah, we'll call it a stream. And then I'll just raid my friend who's playing some 16 right now. Okay. And I will see you guys all later this week. Hopefully I'll have some new videos out. Love you guys so much. And I'll see you next time. Thanks for chatting with me. Peace.